Imagine a city with no land to stand on, only water, a place where grand palaces rise from the sea and streets are replaced by canals. This isn't fantasy, this is Venice. But how did one of the world's most iconic cities come to float on a lagoon, defying nature and empire alike? Born from desperation and exile, Venice began as a refuge, its founders fleeing barbarian invasions after the fall of Rome. With nowhere left to run, they built their homes on wooden stakes driven deep into the marshy waters of the Venetian lagoon. What should have been a temporary solution became a miracle of engineering, resilience, and vision. Over centuries, this improbable settlement transformed into a global powerhouse, the floating empire. It controlled vast trade routes, battled mighty rivals, and left behind a legacy of art, architecture, and innovation that changed the world. But Venice's rise wasn't without betrayal, bloodshed, and brilliance in equal measure. This is more than just a tale of beauty. It's a story of survival, ambition, and ingenuity against the odds. This is the full story of Venice, from hidden origins to global glory. Welcome to the empire that refused to sink. Imagine a city rising out of the sea, not on an island, but on millions of wooden stakes driven into the mud of a hostile lagoon. No fertile land, no fresh water, no armies, and yet it would become one of the wealthiest, most feared powers in the world. This is not fiction. This is Venice. It all began not in glory, but in terror. In the 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire collapsed under waves of barbarian invasions, refugees fled the mainland. They didn't head to mountains or forests, they ran into the sea, literally. They found sanctuary in the shallow, marshy lagoons of the Adriatic coast, places so inhospitable that no invader would bother to follow. The people weren't planning to build a city, they were just trying to survive. But necessity breeds brilliance. With no access to stone or soil, the settlers devised a radical solution: drive logs deep into the seabed, layer them with stone, and build on top. Somehow, it worked. Venice wasn't built on land. It was built on engineering audacity. Over centuries, what began as a desperate act of survival transformed into a stunning, floating marvel. And it wasn't just geography that defined Venice. From the beginning, it rejected kings and emperors. Instead, it chose a doge, an elected leader, not a monarch. It was a republic long before that was fashionable. Governed by councils and guided by merchant ideals, Venice forged a new kind of power, not based on land or bloodline, but trade, diplomacy, and innovation. But here's the catch. How did a people with no natural resources, no army, and no land end up ruling the Mediterranean? Why didn't this fragile city sink into the sea, fade into obscurity, or get crushed by the empires surrounding it? That's the real mystery. The answer lies in the mind-bending genius of Venice's strategy, both literal and political. The city didn't just adapt to its strange environment, it weaponized it. It turned its lagoon into a fortress, its anonymity into an advantage, and its remoteness into leverage. Venice wasn't just built on water, it was built on illusion, resilience, and ambition. And so, from an uninhabitable swamp, rose the floating empire, a civilization that would outwit popes, rival kings, and even Mother Nature herself. But how exactly was this engineering miracle pulled off? How do you build a city on water and make it last 1,000 years? That's what we uncover next. Venice shouldn't exist. That's not poetic, it's architectural heresy. Yet by the year 1000, the city had cathedrals, palaces, and markets, all balanced on mudflats. How? The genius lies in the foundation. Venetians drove millions of wooden piles, mostly alder, a water-resistant tree, straight into the lagoon floor. Underwater, where oxygen is limited, these logs didn't rot. Over time, the soft clay around them compressed into a rock-like base. On this impossible platform, they laid limestone blocks, and then the city began to rise, stone by stone, dream by dream. But Venice didn't just build up, it built wide. The canals we associate with gondolas weren't romantic design choices. They were engineered moats, roads, and sewage systems, all in one. And since traditional roads were impossible, the city became a labyrinth of bridges, narrow alleys, and floating traffic lanes. Venice is perhaps the only city where infrastructure is art. One of the crowning achievements was the Basilica di San Marco. It wasn't merely a church, it was a statement that Venice wasn't just surviving, it was thriving and doing so with Byzantine brilliance. Marble from Constantinople, mosaics from the East, relics of saints acquired during crusades. Every detail whispered, "We are not like you, we are something else." The Grand Canal, the city's main artery, took the shape of a reverse S, not by accident but through centuries of negotiation between land and water. Along its banks, merchants, nobles, and politicians built the most ornate facades possible. Why? Because Venice didn't have castles or fortresses. Their wealth was their weapon, and the beauty of their homes was part of the battle. And what about drinking water? On an island surrounded by salt water, this could have been a death sentence, but Venetians dug ingenious stone-lined cisterns into courtyards, designed to collect and filter rainwater. It was primitive desalination, and it worked. This wasn't urban planning, it was survival turned into spectacle. Every inch of Venice was a rebellion against physics and probability. It wasn't supposed to last a century, let alone a millennium, and yet it stood, defiant and dazzling. So now we ask, with no army and no territory, how did this city of canals rise to become the commercial capital of the world? The answer begins with ships, not just any ships, but fleets built with military precision and mercantile genius. Venice never had vast lands or golden mines. Its power didn't come from conquest, but from control. Control of the seas, control of markets, and most importantly, control of information. In a world where kingdoms waged war over land, Venice quietly became the richest city in Europe by doing one thing better than anyone else: trade. By the 11th century, Venice had transformed into a maritime powerhouse. Strategically positioned between East and West, it became the gateway to Byzantium and the Islamic world. Spices from India, silks from China, gems from Persia, all passed through Venetian hands, and for every shipment they took a cut. But Venice didn't just profit from trade, they engineered it. They forged exclusive trade agreements with the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world, sometimes both at once. While Christian kingdoms fought crusades, Venice sold them ships, and then sold weapons to their enemies. It wasn't betrayal, it was business, their greatest asset. The merchant fleet. By the 1200s, Venice had hundreds of ships sailing across the Mediterranean. But these weren't random vessels, they were part of a state-run system. Venice created scheduled convoys known as MUDE, with armed protection and fixed trade routes. It was the medieval equivalent of FedEx, backed by naval firepower. And behind this machine was meticulous bureaucracy. The Venetian government tracked prices, monitored supply chains, and maintained detailed records. In fact, Venice may have been the first state to fully merge capitalism and governance. Every merchant was both a businessman and a representative of the Republic. Wealth poured in, and with it, power. The Rialto became Europe's financial heart. Venetian gold ducats were accepted from London to Cairo. The city minted its own currency, dictated trade policy across the sea, and even set fashion trends in royal courts. But there was more. Venice also exported its culture. Venetian glassmakers in Murano created treasures so rare they were protected like state secrets. artists, architects, and philosophers turned the city into a jewel of the Renaissance long before Florence took the spotlight. And yet, with this rise came enemies. Genoa, Pisa, the Ottomans, each tried to challenge Venice's supremacy. But Venice had a secret weapon, not just in diplomacy or design, but in production, a place hidden from the world, where ships were built faster than anyone thought possible. In the heart of Venice, hidden behind high walls and guarded like a fortress, was the engine of its empire, the Venetian arsenal. Long before Henry Ford, long before industrialization, Venice built a war machine powered by human precision and organizational genius. The arsenal wasn't just a shipyard, it was the largest industrial complex in Europe for centuries. At its peak, it employed over 16,000 workers and could produce a fully equipped warship in a single day. That wasn't legend, it was logistics. Inside the arsenal, materials flowed like clockwork: wood, iron, rope, sailcloth, all moving through designated stations. Every craftsman had a role. Every process was timed. It was the world's first assembly line. Ships were built in sequence, like clock hands ticking forward, turning raw timber into naval dominance. This efficiency gave Venice something no other city-state could dream of: rapid response. When war broke out, Venice didn't scramble, it launched. When storms destroyed fleets, replacements sailed within days. The arsenal gave Venice not just power, but endurance. And it wasn't just about war. The same system built merchant vessels faster, allowing Venice to flood trade routes and dominate commerce. Every ship launched was a declaration: Venice moves faster than you. Venice adapts quicker. Venice survives. But secrecy was key. The layout of the arsenal was a state secret. Foreigners were banned. Workers were sworn to silence. Designs were protected like royal bloodlines. Venice didn't just invent mass production, they made it invisible. Even Leonardo da Vinci visited the arsenal and was reportedly awestruck. He sketched its cranes, marveled at its efficiency. What the rest of Europe would stumble upon centuries later, Venice had already mastered in silence. And yet, this monumental machine wasn't run by kings or generals. It was run by merchants, practical, calculating, and ruthless. For Venice, the arsenal wasn't just about ships. It was about control, about sending a message. We don't need armies, we build our own, but no empire survives without enemies. And in the shadows of its glittering success, Venice began to play a much more dangerous game, one of espionage, betrayal, and secret wars. Venice wore a mask, elegant, golden, serene. But behind it was a city of spies, sabotage, and shadow warfare. It wasn't the strongest militarily, nor the largest, but Venice mastered something far more dangerous: manipulation. The Republic rarely fought wars it didn't already know how to win. Venetian diplomacy was meticulous and cold-blooded. Rather than conquer territory, Venice brokered favors, bought loyalties, and played its rivals against each other. While kingdoms clashed with swords, Venice changed the battlefield with a whisper and a bribe. Take the Fourth Crusade. In 1202, Venice agreed to transport crusaders to the Holy Land. But when the army couldn't pay, Venice offered a sinister bargain: sack Zara, a Christian city and rival of Venice. Then they diverted the crusade entirely, straight to Constantinople. The result? The greatest Christian city in the East fell, and Venice walked away with unimaginable wealth and influence. That wasn't luck. It was chess. Inside the Republic, the Council of Ten acted like a secret intelligence agency. Centuries before the term existed, they censored information, coordinated espionage, and orchestrated political assassinations. Citizens feared them. Enemies respected them. No decision reached the Doge without the Ten knowing about it. sometimes before he did. Alliances were forged in quiet. Venice made deals with Muslims while the rest of Europe waged holy wars. They traded with the Ottomans even as they prepared for battle. Their enemies often didn't realize a war had started until Venetian ships were already at their shores. Even the infamous masks of Venetian carnivals had a purpose. Behind anonymity, political deals were struck, secrets traded, and spies recruited. Venice was not just a city of canals, it was a theater of shadows. Yet with each masterstroke, the stakes rose. As the Ottomans grew stronger and the tides of global trade shifted, Venice's delicate game became harder to control. Old rivals became desperate, new powers emerged, and then the unthinkable came, not from an enemy's sword, but from within. A tiny parasite carried by fleas would rip through Venice and test its resilience like never before. In 1348, death sailed silently into the Venetian lagoon. The Black Plague arrived not with armies, but aboard merchant ships, the same ships that had once built the empire. Within weeks, thousands were dead. Within months, half the city was gone. Venice, the city of trade, was suddenly its own greatest threat. The canals that carried wealth now carried disease. The tightly packed alleys became traps. The Republic faced a terrifying paradox. The very networks that made it powerful were killing it. But Venice didn't collapse. It adapted. Fast. The city created one of history's first public health systems. The term quarantine comes from 40 giorni, 40 days, how long ships were held at anchor on nearby islands before unloading. Venice turned isolation into policy and medicine into law. They built lazaretti, isolated plague hospitals, on deserted islets. No other city in Europe reacted with such speed or coordination. Even funerals were regulated. Masks became a tool of survival, not just celebration. The long-nosed plague doctor mask, filled with herbs, was born here. Fear met formality, chaos met protocol. In true Venetian fashion, even death became an organized system. But the plague didn't just attack bodies, it destabilized politics. The patrician class, once untouchable, was decimated. Power began to shift. New families rose, old dynasties fell. The Doge, once symbolic, became more tightly controlled by councils. Venice, in mourning, restructured its soul. Economically, the city bled. Trade routes were disrupted. Rivals saw weakness. But Venice didn't fold. It pivoted. It doubled down on naval innovation, pushed harder into eastern markets, and reinforced its defensive walls. While other cities crumbled under panic, Venice hardened into a machine. And through it all, art flourished. Why? Because Venetians knew life was fragile. In response to death, they built beauty. Churches were adorned, palazzos painted, music composed. Venice sang in the face of extinction. But even as the Republic survived the plague, the world was changing. A new continent had been discovered. Sea routes around Africa were cutting into Venetian profits. The Ottomans were growing bolder. The old playbook was starting to fail. Venice had survived death itself. But could it survive irrelevance? For 1,000 years, Venice defied every rule of empire. It had no king, no standing army, and no vast territory. Yet by the 15th century, it stood as the longest-lasting republic in history. But nothing lasts forever, not even the floating empire. The warning signs came slowly. As the age of exploration exploded, the old Mediterranean trade routes shrank in importance. Portugal and Spain began importing spices directly from Asia, bypassing Venetian monopolies. Venice, once the gatekeeper between East and West, was becoming obsolete. Then came the Ottomans. In 1453, Constantinople fell. The Byzantines were gone, and with them, Venice's most vital trading partner. The Ottomans seized key ports, disrupted maritime routes, and began to dominate the seas Venice once ruled. Venice fought fiercely, wars raged for decades, but each battle drained the Republic's coffers and pride. At home, the Republic was decaying from within. The tight-knit aristocracy had grown corrupt and complacent. Innovation slowed, risk was feared, and the once flexible political machine hardened into bureaucracy. Venice became a museum of its former self, beautiful, preserved, and slowly dying. By the 18th century, Venice was politically irrelevant. Its power was ceremonial, its navy outdated, its wealth a memory. But its illusion remained strong, so strong, in fact, that even Napoleon noticed. In 1797, Napoleon Bonaparte marched into Venice and ended the Republic without a single major battle. The Great Council was dissolved. The Doge was forced to abdicate. A 1,000-year-old government disappeared in weeks. But Venice didn't burn. It didn't fight back. It didn't erupt. The city that once manipulated empires bowed out with a whisper. It was as if Venice had always known this day would come and chose to leave the stage with grace. Still, the fall was not total ruin. Its art, its architecture, its canals, all survived. Venice lost its crown, but not its soul. What remained was something rare, a city whose ruins still shimmered, whose decay still dazzled, a city trapped between past glory and uncertain future. But even now, long after its empire faded, Venice faces its most existential threat yet. Not from foreign powers or political revolutions, but from the water itself. Venice, once the ruler of seas, now wages war against water itself. Each year, the city sinks millimeter by millimeter. Its streets flood with eerie regularity. Locals call it acqua alta, the high water. For tourists, it's a spectacle. For Venetians, it's survival. Climate change has accelerated what gravity began centuries ago. Rising sea levels, crumbling foundations, and subsiding ground threaten to drown the city for good. The very water that once protected Venice now threatens to consume it. But Venice has never accepted defeat, not from invaders, plagues, or the sea. In 2003, the Italian government launched MOSE, a billion-euro engineering marvel designed to protect the lagoon. It consists of 78 mobile barriers that rise from the seabed to block storm surges. Critics called it too ambitious, too late, too corrupt. But in 2020, it worked. For the first time, Venice stayed dry during a major flood. Yet MOSE is a bandage, not a cure. The problem isn't just flooding, it's depopulation. The city's population has plummeted from over 175,000 to fewer than 50,000 residents. Tourists outnumber locals 370 to 1. The city often feels like a theme park for history, not a place to live. But under the surface, Venice pulses with resilience. Artisans still blow glass in Murano. Fishermen still cast nets in the lagoon. Students debate in old libraries. Protests rise against cruise ships. Locals fight for preservation. The spirit of resistance, the same that built a city on water, remains. Venice today is not an empire. It's a memory made tangible, a warning carved in stone, a miracle that still floats, barely. But it's also a mirror, a reflection of what happens when innovation is traded for nostalgia, when power is replaced by beauty. So is Venice sinking? Yes, but it's also surviving, adapting, dreaming, just like it always has. In a world obsessed with speed, Venice moves slow. In a world of skyscrapers, it stands close to sea level. In a world of noise, it whispers its story. And that story is this: Venice should never have existed, and yet it did. And that's what makes it eternal.